Welcome back to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. In other national news, 2 years after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, forcing areas of the country with a history of racial discrimination to get approval or pre-clearance from the Justice Department or a federal court before making any changes to voting laws. But this morning, almost half a century after it was first passed, the Supreme Court struck down a key portion of the law. Chief Justice Roberts' position is that the world does not look the same as it did in 1965. According to Roberts, our country has changed, and while any racial discrimination in voting is too much, Congress must ensure that the legislation it passes to remedy that problem speaks to current conditions. Congress had overwhelmingly extended the Voting Rights Act as recently as 2006 for another 25 years. In a statement today, President Obama said he is deeply disappointed with the ruling, saying, quote, voting discrimination still exists. And while today's decision is a setback, it does not represent the end of our efforts to end voting discrimination. I'm calling on Congress to pass legislation to ensure every American has equal access to the polls. But as Justice Robert points out in his opinion, black voter turnout was higher than whites in last year's election, including in 5 out of the 6 states originally included in the Voting Rights Act. Joining me now is the Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. He's founder and president of the Rainbow Push Coalition, was obviously at the I Have a Dream speech. Reverend Jackson, thanks for joining us. Reverend, Chief Justice Roberts writes in the opinion that, yes, voter discrimination still exists, but this section of the law, particularly singling out states that have been under this rule since the 60s and 70s, is outdated. What is your response?
Well, it's not true. The fact of the matter is that we have more voter participation because of voter oversight. When oversight leaves, then the increases actually stop. We got the right to vote in 1965. It took us to 1990 to deal with the impact of gerrymandering, annexation, at-large, roll purging. And I might add, Jake, it was not just for blacks. When the blacks could not vote, but white women could not serve on juries. There was no white woman on the Supreme Court. 18-year-olds who were serving in Vietnam could not vote. Students could not vote on college campus. They had to vote absentee or go home to vote. You could not vote bilingually. So the whole democratizing of democracy, it's a 48-year journey that was stabbed in the heart today.
What do you say to those who say African-American vote, according to a census study, was higher than the white vote last year? We have an African-American president. This is just a different world than in 1965, and these states and counties that were singled out for special scrutiny don't deserve the same scrutiny.
You know, in 1865, we had the right to vote, but the compromise of 1877, you removed the federal troops, you removed protection. By 1896, we were set back for another 58 years. And so without federal oversight, it's like removing the troops in 1877. These state legislatures, like Alabama, like Louisiana, that tried last year to use redistricting, and they tried to use voter suppression tactics and schemes to limit voting and make voting more difficult. They now have full reign for states' rights. It's now replaced federal protection. That's a very dangerous setback.
Your organization, the Rainbow Push Coalition, says it will not stand idly by after the decision. What does that mean? What do you and other civil rights organizations that you speak to, what do you plan to do?
I think, first of all, the president has taken a very strong position today because he knows that without the protected right, he would not have been president in the first place. He must use his power to convene the Congress and make a case to the nation, as Lyndon Johnson made a case to the nation. Hope President Obama will make a case to the nation on why we must stop any scheme that suppresses or limits voting access or the right to vote and to win. The second thing, we must go back to the streets in great numbers and demand and create a broad-based public consensus bottom up. The right to vote is too precious. We've bled too much. We've died too young, and the price has been too great to now watch it stabbed in the heart by the Supreme Court today.
Before you go, Reverend, Nelson Mandela is in critical condition right now in South Africa, as you know. As somebody who knows him, as somebody who has fought for civil rights, what does Nelson Mandela mean to you?
Well, on top of his grandson, just he version that prayers for him around the world, but he was the symbol of the force that brought down racist apartheid South Africa with the help of those here in America and around the world. Not only was he a symbol for it, but then he suffered for it. 27 years in jail much of it in isolation. But beyond that, he not only was a world historical figure, he came out and became a transformative figure. He had awesome power when he came out of jail. He chose reconciliation over retribution. He chose to build a new and greater South Africa and not go to a divided one based upon the ancient fears. So his choice of reconciliation over retribution makes him a statesman of our time and a great moral authority. And no matter what happens, Jake, death cannot rob us of essential Mandela. But his work and worth will long be remembered, and we'll long benefit from it.
Reverend Jesse Jackson, thank you so much for your time. CNN will bring you live coverage of the Supreme Court decision tomorrow on same-sex marriage. It's tomorrow at 10 a.m.